One of the conclusions of British writer Anthony Summers, who did one of the most extensive investigations of Marilyn's relationship with the Kennedy brothers for his biography, Goddess: The Secret Lives of Marilyn Monroe, was that for many months she engaged in intermittent sexual encounters with both the president and Robert Kennedy. The Attorney General, never the womanizer his brother was, may have begun his relationship with Marilyn as a rescue mission, an attempt to steer her into emotional calm. I appreciate that Anthony Summers is trying to put a positive spin on what Robert was doing, but is it Bobby's problem to steer Marilyn into the waters of emotional calm? That is like that is an excuse made by some man trying to cover another man. Please. Since when have you ever heard of some man caring about your emotions so much that he's going to take up for you after somebody else casts you aside and then he comes to your rescue to help steer you into emotional calm? I mean, please. Hello, how are you? Welcome to my channel. My name is Cheer Denise, and today we're going to keep going in The Other Mrs. Kennedy. We have finally reached the part about Marilyn Monroe, and it's a sizable chapter, so it'll be mostly what we talk about today. The Marilyn Monroe stuff is pretty gritty, and in fact, I don't usually do any sort of, trigger warning or anything like that, but the conversation between the men about Marilyn Monroe is filthy. And even I was like, how am I going to read that out loud? I don't want to say that stuff. I probably will read it, but just know it's not good. So if you find yourself needing to hit that 10-second to get past it, I understand, because it's kind of gross. And it's just unfortunate. It's unfortunate that anybody's life was used up so horrifically. She was such a lost person, and I just feel like there were so many people who took advantage of that because she was exceedingly sexy, and they wanted a little bit of that. And we've talked at length about Marilyn Monroe and other books and stuff, but I do think that this chapter was interesting because we hit on a couple of things. Well, of course we would hit on a couple of things we talked about in Ask Not, but this gives us a little bit more detail about some of the circumstances, shines a little bit more light on a couple of different episodes, particularly the fact that Jean Kennedy apparently had told Marilyn Monroe in a letter that was found in her possessions that she loved the idea of her brother being with Marilyn and that Marilyn was always welcome at their house, and that she would love for Marilyn to come to Hyannisport and spend a weekend with the Kennedy family. And when that letter was discovered, Jean at the time had said, I don't know anything about that, no idea what that's about. It's not for me kind of attitude. But then things came out later that showed that it was from her, and then she had to kind of backtrack. So I thought that was really interesting because we did hear about Jean saying that to Marilyn, or that there was some communication to Marilyn that Jean approved of the relationship. But now that we know how close Ethel was to Jean, having been her roommate in college and being best friends, and it was really Jean who put together Bobby and Ethel, it's even more of a betrayal that Jean would have said those sorts of things. When I read about it in Ask Not, I thought, well, those Kennedys are some backstabbers as far as how would you treat your sister-in-law like that? But then at the same time, I really wasn't sure how close Jean was with Ethel. But now, knowing how close they are, I'm like, Jean, how could you have ever said that to Marilyn? Your brother's having this steamy affair. One of your brothers, both have, but now Bobby's ingrained with Marilyn, and your response is just out with the old, in with the new. Very upsetting. So anyway, I love this chapter for the color it gave us on an incident we talked about before. We get a lot more about it here, and we also get to talk about Ethel's side of it, which was not something that we covered at all when we read Ask Not. So, Chapter 66, The Monroe Affair. I want to be played by Marilyn Monroe, Ethel said with a mischievous grin. She'd do me perfectly. Ethel's fantasy game involved the casting of the film version of Bobby's bestseller, The Enemy Within. Bobby had dedicated the book to Ethel, quote, whose love through this long struggle made the difficult easy, the impossible possible. Ethel's tongue-in-cheek choice of Marilyn would prove to be both curious and ironic. 20th Century Fox had secured the film rights following publication in 1960. A number of writers had been mentioned to do the screenplay, but Bobby favored Bud Schulberg, who'd scripted On the Waterfront. By the fall of 1961, Schulberg had a draft script in hand. Producer Jerry Wald had planted stories in the New York Times and elsewhere disclosing that Paul Newman had been signed to play the role of Bobby. Wald also let it be known that he wanted Robert Mitchum as a corrupt labor leader and Spencer Tracy to play a management character. The storyline was centered on Bobby's conflicts with Jimmy Hoffa and Dave Beck. With shooting tentatively scheduled to begin in the winter of 1961 in Washington and New York, Schulberg began holding meetings with Bobby and Ethel at Hickory Hill to get their input for the final draft of the script. Ethel was very supportive of the project, Schulberg remembered. She'd read my script and had suggestions about the treatment of her and Bobby and their roles in some of the scenes. Ethel gently protested that the dialogue I'd written for them wasn't exactly the way they'd actually talk to each other. After a point, I had Ethel practically writing her own lines. She'd say to me, "It should be more offhand. I wouldn't say it that way." And she'd write it her way. I didn't think of Ethel as a great intellectual, but I did find her to be a very quick study, and she had a very good memory. Even if it was a joke, Ethel's talk about wanting Monroe to play her on film had gone beyond the private meetings with Schulberg at Hickory Hill. Bobby's assistant at Justice, Bill Gohegan, began hearing talk about it around the Attorney General's office. In the period between 1961 and 1962, when Schulberg was having his meetings with Bobby and Ethel, the screenwriters and others in Hollywood circle had started hearing gossip and innuendos in Hollywood that both Jack and Bobby had become involved romantically with Monroe. I thought it was quite ironic that the actress being talked about as an intimate of Bobby was the same woman Ethel was casting to play her in the film, Schulberg said later. It was eerie. I think it was probably Ethel's way of saying I know what's happening. Being playful and silly and like, ooh, let's get Marilyn Monroe to play me. But really, it's as close as she was going to come to saying Marilyn's taking my spot in life. In the end, Ethel never got an opportunity to see herself portrayed on screen by Marilyn Monroe, or anyone else for that matter. Newman, for one, turned down the role because Hoffa had disappeared, and the actor felt the story was unresolved. While Bobby understood Newman's reason for dropping out of the project, the two got into a heated argument when Newman told Bobby that he planned to narrate a critical documentary of Kennedy's pal Joe McCarthy. Then, in the summer of 1962, Jerry Wald died, and the entire project was put on hold. Later, Schulberg said Hollywood dropped the idea completely after veiled threats were made concerning labor problems at the studios if the picture was made. Meanwhile, the rumors about a relationship between Marilyn and Bobby had begun reaching Ethel's ears. While the movie deal fell through, the actress Ethel hoped would play her would in effect come to haunt her. Jack had been introduced to Marilyn in the late 1950s by his brother-in-law, Peter Lawford. Peter Lawford is just such a scummy little man. The way he behaved and the way he acted so entitled about everything. I mean, there's just this sense about him. Every quote that I've ever read from him is like this idea that he had every right to muck around in people's lives. And like, the consequences come what may. Just sort of being like, yeah, things kind of fell apart. It's pretty bad. I mean, I don't know. Maybe I have a completely wrong idea of him. Maybe if I read a biography of him, I'd be like, okay, I can see this person as a human. But right now, all he is to me is a little lizard. Anyway, a heavy drinker and drug user, Lawford had kinky tastes and had cheated constantly during his marriage to Pat Kennedy, acting out his proclivities with prostitutes and mistresses. Her Catholic upbringing, her nightly prayers, and her other acts of devotion were unnerving for him, Patricia Seton Lawford stated. The president, like many men, had long had his eye on Marilyn, America's premier sex symbol. Hospitalized for a back problem when he was a senator, Jack had kept a pinup of her on the wall near his bed. The photo was of Marilyn in tight shorts, standing with her legs spread, but Jack had hung it upside down, so Marilyn's legs were in the air. We've heard about that. Ethel had been aware of Jack's cheating. When the subject was brought up in her presence during the 1960 campaign, she was quick to react. Ethel and a friend were being driven to an airport in New York by a young woman who, assuming Jack's philandering was an open secret, began jabbering about it. Ethel was so furious, so upset, recalled the pal. Because we were in a moving car, Ethel couldn't get away. She finally told the girl, "We're not talking about any such thing, don't be an idiot," or something along those lines. She didn't like what was going on. But boy, once Jack became president, he could have brought Hitler in there and she wouldn't have said anything. She turned the other cheek after that. But remember, this is the girl who, in college, could not comprehend that a man would cheat on his wife. Because remember, she had heard about Joe Kennedy having cheated on Rose, and she flipped out, and people said that she was so naive that in her mind, adultery was something that was in the Ten Commandments, but not something actually done. Which makes me just want to say, girl, you realize the Ten Commandments are because people do those things. Anyway, I'm agitated by Ethel's ability to compartmentalize. To a fault, I feel like. because she knew what was going on, and yet she just seemed to do nothing about it. She didn't say anything, she just pretended it wasn't happening, and as the chapter goes on, and also as we've seen, she wasn't above procuring people for the men in the Kennedy family. Not explicitly, but she just continued to sort of live in la-la land and pretend that what she was doing wasn't going to end up in somebody cheating on somebody else. Ethel had met Marilyn for the first time on February 1st, 1962, at a going-away party that the Lawfords threw for the Kennedys on the eve of their world tour. While Ethel felt sisterly toward Pat Lawford, she despised Peter, and the feeling was mutual. Peter hated Ethel, Patricia Seton Lawford said. He felt that she was self-righteous, and he called her Miss Skakel. He said Ethel was always wagging her index finger at him in her mind. But Ethel and Lawford kept their feelings to themselves and tried to act civil in each other's presence. A number of Hollywood's biggest names had been invited to the Lawfords' 27-room mansion on the Pacific Ocean for Ethel and Bobby's party. The brightest star among them was Marilyn, who, as usual, arrived late, driving up among the Rolls-Royces and Bentleys in a lowly VW. Stepping out of the little car wearing a clinging black dress, a mink over her shoulders, and bathed in Chanel No. 5, she was besieged by a horde of photographers who wanted to know who her escort was. "Oh, just a sailor I've been dating," she said, winking. Actually, he was the makeup artist Whitey Snyder who'd given her a lift. Pat Kennedy Lawford, typically effusive, ushered Marilyn into the living room. "I wasn't sure you would come with this huge crowd." "Are you kidding?" Marilyn responded. "I'm dying to meet Bobby." Pat told Marilyn that Bobby would be seated between her and Kim Novak at dinner. "Is that close enough?" Pat asked. Marilyn giggled. "Thanks a lot for Kim," she said sarcastically. Besides Novak, the other glamorous guests at the party included Natalie Wood and Janet Leigh, but Bobby only had eyes for Marilyn. Friends of Marilyn stated later that they had seen her with Bobby long before the Lawford party. To avoid any questioning looks from Ethel, Bobby feigned boyish bashfulness and had to be coaxed by his sister to talk to Marilyn. Ethel watched from across the room as her husband and the sex goddess sat intimately together on the floor. "What does an attorney general do?" Marilyn wrote in lipstick on a cocktail napkin that she passed to Bobby. Later, Ethel watched, a smile frozen on her face, as Marilyn taught Bobby how to twist. By the end of the night, Marilyn had consumed much champagne and needed a lift home. Anyone could have taken her, but she left with Bobby and Ed Guthman, his press aide. "Bobby asked me to come along too," Guthman said later. "He didn't say why, but his reason was pretty obvious. He didn't want to be seen going off alone in a car at night with Marilyn Monroe." With Bobby driving, Marilyn beside him, and Guthman in the back seat, the three went directly to her Brentwood home and dropped her in the care of the housekeeper. The next day, Bobby and Ethel flew to Honolulu, the first leg of their trip. While Bobby had lost much of his taste for George Terrien after this questionable marriage to Ethel's sister Georgianne, he still talked to him. After all, the two went back a long way. Sometime in mid-1962, as Terrien later remembered, he and Bobby were reminiscing on the telephone about the old days when the Attorney General made a startling confession. Now, let me just say, George Terrien says that Bobby, in explicit terms, revealed to him that he was sleeping with Marilyn Monroe. George Terrien is another one of those little lizards who seems to be slimy to the extreme and who is over here being the fixer for other people and their, relationships. His brother-in-law calls him when his sister-in-law burns the house down, right? And he's supposed to fix it with the police. And I just think that George is not necessarily a person whose word can be trusted in the extreme. I think that we can understand that the flavor of what he's saying is probably true, but I'm just not sure if Bobby told it to him in this way. And maybe I'm overselling it. Maybe I'm going to read this to you and you're going to be like, "Girl, stop. What are you, some kind of hothouse flower? It's not that big of a deal." I guess it just seems gross that Bobby was talking to somebody else about his fling with Marilyn in this way when he has a wife and like a bajillion kids at home. And while Bobby certainly wasn't the philanderer that Jack was, it'd be very hard to keep up with Jack. I think that Bobby felt like in order to be a real man, he had to be sleeping around with all these women. And I'm not saying that he was innocent in any way, but I'm just saying I think that his involvement with Marilyn was less animalistic maybe than his brother's involvement. I think he did feel sorry for her. I think he was enamored by her. But anyway, I'm just dragging it out. All this to say, George Terrien's description of this conversation is pretty raunchy, and it's just hard to imagine that this is how Bobby talked, but maybe it really is. Said Tyrion. Bobby was sounding very macho and full of himself. Out of the blue, he said, George would keel over if he knew who I was screwing. First of all, I was flabbergasted that Bobby used that word because he rarely used that kind of language. Secondly, I thought he was joking because as far as I was concerned, and everyone in the family was concerned, Bobby and Ethel had a good marriage. She idolized him. We all knew Jack was effing around, but I couldn't conceive of Bobby having a thing with anybody but Effie. So I said, you are the biggest bullshitter in the world. You wouldn't have the balls to play around. And he said, just tell George I've had Marilyn's pussy. I said, what the hell are you talking about? Marilyn who? And Bobby said, and he was laughing, you know the woman Jack used to jack off over? Marilyn Monroe. After he finished with her, she fell for me. I think she's in love with me. I told Bobby, you're full of shit. And he laughed, and that was the end of the conversation. I thought he was full of shit then, and I think he's full of shit now. I can't imagine Marilyn Monroe getting in bed with that little jerk. But Tyrion immediately telephoned George Skakel to pass on Bobby's boast. George fell over laughing, Tyrion recalled. He couldn't stand Bobby, and the idea that Bobby would be having a thing with Marilyn Monroe was too much for him. She wouldn't F him even with my dick, George said, dismissing what Bobby had said as pure bullshit. You show me the pictures, and just maybe, then I'll believe it. I also told Georgianne about it, and she laughed. She said, the Kennedy men are a bunch of sophomoric brats. Don't believe it. I don't. Ethel would giggle if she heard that one. As far as I was concerned, none of the Skakels ever put any credence in the story. Whether Ethel did, I don't know. Never in a million years would I have brought it up to her, and neither would her brothers or sisters. After the Lawford party, Ethel didn't see Bobby together with Marilyn for another 2.5 months. That occasion was also the first and last time the principal players in the drama, Ethel, Bobby, Marilyn, Jack, and Peter Lawford, were ever seen together in public. The date was May 19th, 1962. The location was Madison Square Garden. The event was a star-studded celebration of Jack's 45th birthday before an audience of some 20,000 loyal Democrats. At Lawford's behest, Marilyn had agreed to sing Happy Birthday to the president. For insiders, the event seemed like a sick practical joke being perpetrated on the American electorate, who were unaware of the behind-the-scenes shenanigans. As usual, Marilyn was late, and Lawford, the MC, joked about her tardiness. Jack, Ethel, and Bobby laughed when Lawford announced, Mr. President, on this occasion of your birthday, this lovely lady is not only pulchritudinous, but punctual. Mr. President, Marilyn Monroe. All eyes turned, but she did not appear. Other entertainers performed in the meantime. Then Lawford was at the microphone again. A woman of whom it may truly be said, she needs no introduction, he teased. But Marilyn was nowhere to be seen. Finally, after a few more acts appeared, Lawford announced, Mr. President. Because, in the history of show business, perhaps there has been no one female who has meant so much, who has done more, Mr. President, the late Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn finally appeared from the wings in what would later become known as the Kennedy dress, a $12,000 beaded Jean Louis original that appeared to be painted on her body. In fact, Marilyn had to be stitched into the dress, which was made with special panels to cover her breasts and genitalia because she refused to wear panties or bra. A small slit at the bottom of the dress allowed her freedom to take small, mincing steps. Watching her walk on stage, Jack commented to another guest, What an ass. What an ass. With Ethel seated beside him, Bobby said nothing. In a whisper-soft little girl voice, Marilyn looked at Jack and sang Happy Birthday as no one had ever sung that song before. After the applause died, she sang another song especially written for the occasion by Richard Adler, to the tune of Bob Hope's theme, Thanks for the Memory. Marilyn then led the audience in another rendition of Happy Birthday. Afterward, the president came to the stage. Thank you, he said. I can now retire from politics after having Happy Birthday sung to me in such a sweet, wholesome way. Jackie, aware of her husband's affair, was noticeably absent. She'd spent the day horseback riding in Virginia. Backstage, Marilyn needed to recover from the performance. She had to be literally cut out of her dress and bathed with cold towels to lower her body temperature. She then left for a party where Jack and Bobby were waiting at the penthouse apartment of United Artists executive Arthur Krim. There, with Ethel looking on, Bobby danced with Marilyn at least 5 times, a fact that did not go unnoticed by Dorothy Kilgallen, who gleefully noted the fact in her gossip column the next morning. Bobby cockily walked around arm in arm with Marilyn, a scene witnessed by other partygoers, including important journalists. At one point late in the evening, a candid photo was taken of Marilyn huddled with Jack and Bobby, the only published shot of her with both brothers. In her skin-tight gown, her right breast was pointed at Bobby and her left at Jack. One of the reporters at the party, UPI White House correspondent Merriman Smith, approached Bobby and Marilyn, and the Attorney General was forced to introduce them. Later, he grew concerned when he caught sight of Smith talking to Marilyn and taking notes. He also was anxious about the photo that had been taken. The distinguished Adlai Stevenson, like all the men that night, was overwhelmed by Marilyn. He later wrote to a friend, Mary Lasker, telling her that he finally got to talk to Marilyn, after breaking through the strong defenses established by Robert Kennedy, who was dodging around her like a moth around the flame. Also present was Arthur M. Schlesinger, Jr., who noted later in his biography of Bobby that he himself, quote, had never seen anyone so beautiful as Marilyn. Bobby and I engaged in mock competition for her. She was most agreeable to him and pleasant to me, but then she receded into her own glittering mist. In fact, Marilyn did more than recede, as Schlesinger put it so poetically. Sometime after 1 a.m., she and the president actually disappeared from the party, followed by Secret Service agents. The two went to Kennedy's private suite at the Carlisle Hotel, supposedly for their last rendezvous. Marilyn did not return to her own Manhattan apartment until several hours later. It had been quite an evening. The next morning, Ethel and Bobby returned to Hickory Hill. Ethel was irate at Bobby's behavior with Marilyn, but did not make an issue of it at the time. A few days later, though, she telephoned her sister. Effie told Georgianne that she was furious with Bobby and would have liked to scratch that tramp's eyes out. George Terrian recalled. But Ethel was a good Kennedy wife. She kept her mouth shut and looked the other way, like they all did. See, this is what I do not understand. This is my main issue with the way Ethel looks at being a wife. I don't have any problem with her wanting to be her husband's cheerleader. I think that's sweet. I don't have any problem with her letting him make the main decisions and, she basically following suit. A household has to have some kind of leader. We can't have two people that are constantly butting heads and trying to, control everything. And I mean, that has its own problems, right? So I'm really not opposed to the way she was his wife. But my issue is this, Ethel, you cannot believe that being a agreeable wife means that you neglect your role as helpmate, which is what you're supposed to be doing as well. And being a helpmate means that you don't let your spouse continue on in patterns of destructive behavior that you know about and that you've witnessed, and you just never question because you don't want to rock the boat. That's selfishness. It's selfishness and cowardice to know that your spouse is involved in things that they shouldn't be involved in and never say boo about it. And I know it's hard to do. You don't want to be combative. You don't want to be difficult. You don't want to be a bitch. You don't want to be a nag. I get it. But at the same time, if you know that your spouse is screwing around with all of these women, and having these issues, if you guys are so worried about his reputation, all this, how could you turn a blind eye? Wouldn't you at any point say to him, hey, your reputation matters a lot to your success in life. I know what's going on. I'm not okay with what's going on. And I would hope that you would stop because you love me. But if anything, consider the fact that you're not going to get ahead in life if you have to constantly combat these stories that have to do with you fooling around all the time. Because Ethel must not have cared that much because she never said anything about it. But she certainly cared about his reputation. So even if she threaded the needle that way, but how are you a helpmate to your spouse if you just continue to let them fall down into this pit of self-destruction? Because having a conversation might be awkward. Well, wouldn't it be better for it to have an awkward conversation, but then to find them in some sort of horrific situation they can't get out of, or your whole family is falling apart because they've decided to mess with the wrong person who then decides to come into your life and destroy your life? I mean, any number of things could happen. Have the awkward conversation. Okay, TED Talk over. Let's see. Ethel turned to affairs of state to keep herself from dwelling on the suspected affairs of her husband. Her first priority was to write a speech that she had to deliver on May 27, 1962, to the graduates of St. Bernard College, operated by the Catholic Benedictine Order in Cullman, Alabama. It was Ethel's first commencement address, and she also received an honorary degree of Doctorate of Humanities. Through the summer of 1962, Bobby's relationship with Marilyn continued, while Marilyn's emotional and physical condition deteriorated. Her career had gone down the tubes. She was depressed over her relationships with Jack and Bobby. She was drinking heavily. During that period, beginning in June and late July, Marilyn made numerous telephone calls to Bobby at the Justice Department, and she received calls from him. An unpublished photograph taken at Lawford home during this time reportedly showed Peter standing with Bobby and Marilyn, who was wearing a skimpy robe and holding a bottle of champagne. The snapshot suggested that Bobby was making trips to California on the sly without Ethel's knowledge. A friend and neighbor of Marilyn's asserted that she'd seen Bobby and Marilyn hug, kiss, and drink wine together. Meanwhile, Marilyn was affirming to friends the rumors they were hearing, that she'd been passed from Jack to Bobby. Bill Gogegan said that he once heard from powerful Washington attorney Edward Bennett Williams that Peter Lawford had urged Monroe to, quote, fall all over Bobby at a party. Which Lawford would have said that because he didn't like Ethel, so probably hurting Ethel was a side benefit to him. Williams, according to his biographer, Evan Thomas, was intrigued with the lives of the Kennedys and had learned that Bobby and Jack had become involved with Monroe. On one occasion, Williams had a meeting with an investigator who needed advice because he'd been hired by Joe Kennedy to spy on Monroe and didn't know what to do. Williams never revealed how he advised the man, according to Thomas. One of the more interesting pieces of the Marilyn-Bobby puzzle was a mysterious, undated, handwritten note purportedly signed by Jean Kennedy Smith that was found among Marilyn's papers. Of the Kennedy sisters, Ethel had always been closest to Jean, her roommate at Manhattanville, and the one who'd prodded the relationship along between her and Bobby. Yet the note, if genuine, bore the address of the Kennedys' Palm Beach home and suggested strong approval of a relationship between Bobby and Marilyn. The writer stated to Marilyn that you and Bobby are the new item, and invited her to join Bobby for a Kennedy family visit. No one had ever been able to give a credible explanation for the note, and Jean Kennedy Smith said she had no recollection of ever having written it. But all that changed when the note came up for auction years later, in May 1994, sparking a flurry of gossip items in newspapers. Jean, then serving as U.S. ambassador to Ireland, sent a fax to the Washington Post, claiming that the note's language had been misinterpreted. The suggestion that the letter verifies an affair is utter nonsense, she wrote. I am shocked anyone would believe such innuendo about a letter obviously written in jest. What a classic, clunky denial. That's always what they try to get you to believe. I can't believe you'd believe something so crazy. I can't believe you would believe that. That's not a denial. That's not, I never wrote that letter. I don't know where that came from. I have never in my life seen that, and this is a complete and total prank, and it should not be sold under my name as having written it. That is a denial. I can't believe somebody would believe that. Why would anyone think that this is, like, even serious? This is a jest. Is it a jest? Is it? I mean, somebody need to have sat her down and, like, given her a couple of lessons on how to lie effectively. Not that we should do that, but this is the worst. This is not credible. Anyway, she's shocked that you'd believe any of this. Jean's response, however, confirmed for the first time that she had in fact written the mysterious missive, prank or no prank. As Marilyn's emotional state worsened, she began making odd and contradictory statements. She told some friends that Bobby might divorce Ethel and marry her. Still others that Bobby had cut off their relationship, and that she was thinking about exposing the Kennedys. In early August, several days before the end, Marilyn asked Mickey Song, a Los Angeles hairstylist for the Kennedys, to come to her house. He thought she needed her hair done, but instead Marilyn began probing him about the Kennedy marriages. What about Bobby and Ethel? I can't believe that's a happy marriage. What does he see in her? Later, Song said he felt Marilyn was seeking information to use against the Kennedys. On August 3rd, Dorothy Kilgallen ran a blind item about Bobby and Marilyn's relationship. It said, Marilyn Monroe is cooking in the sex appeal department. She has appeared vastly alluring to a handsome gentleman with a bigger name than Joe DiMaggio in his heyday, so don't write her off. That same day, Marilyn learned from the Hyannisport compound that Bobby, Ethel, and several of the children had flown to San Francisco, where the Attorney General was scheduled to address the American Bar Association. Marilyn made several calls to the St. Francis, where they were staying, leaving messages for Bobby. Agitated, she took sleeping pills that night, but was awakened constantly by an anonymous female caller who said, "Leave Bobby alone, you tramp! Leave Bobby alone!" The next morning, August 4th, Marilyn looked sick, describing the telephone calls to her friend Jean Carmen. Marilyn said she couldn't tell who it was. She didn't think it was Ethel, Carmen said. Who else would it be but Ethel? Especially that particular word tramp. That's what Ethel had used when she described her annoyance with Marilyn when she called her sister Georgianne. So I think that it was Ethel. And who else would know about it? What other woman would call in his defense? particularly because Ethel was with Bobby on this trip, so she may have heard that Marilyn was calling for Bobby over and over. I just can't imagine anybody else in the entourage that would have called Marilyn, unless perhaps there was a traveling companion of Ethel's who wanted to take up for her. I don't know. Sometime on August 4th, at Lawford's request, Bobby quietly slipped into Los Angeles and met for the last time with the distraught Marilyn. Late that night, at age 36, a depressed Marilyn Monroe died after taking too many sleeping pills. One of the conclusions of British writer Anthony Summers, who did one of the most extensive investigations of Marilyn's relationship with the Kennedy brothers for his biography, Goddess, The Secret Lives of Marilyn Monroe, was that for many months she engaged in intermittent sexual encounters with both the president and Robert Kennedy. The Attorney General, never the womanizer his brother was, may have begun his relationship with Marilyn as a rescue mission, an attempt to steer her into emotional calm. Soon, though, perhaps initially tempted to follow his brother merely in grasping the sexual prize, Robert then fell for the flickering light of Marilyn's fragile spirit. Their affair lasted for months. Then, alarmed by the flood of reports that criminals were hoping to take advantage of the Kennedys' follies, the Attorney General tried to sever the connection. But it was not easily done. I appreciate that Anthony Summers is trying to put a positive spin on what Robert was doing, but is it Bobby's problem to steer Marilyn into the waters of emotional calm? That is like that is an excuse made by some man trying to cover another man. Please. Since when have you ever heard of some man caring about your emotions so much that he's going to take up for you after somebody else casts you aside and then he comes to your rescue to help steer you into emotional calm? I mean, please. Despite the numerous unofficial scenarios by credible writers like Summers and by various researchers and private investigators who have alleged everything from a murder conspiracy involving Bobby and Peter Lawford to a Kennedy-instigated massive cover-up, no formal conclusion has ever been reached about the circumstances surrounding Marilyn's untimely death, and it remains as much a mystery today as it was on that night in August 1962. The question of a Kennedy cover-up of the Monroe affair, this one with Ethel as a possible prime player, arose again in 1985 when ABC News chief Roone Arledge suddenly and inexplicably killed a 2020 investigative segment on the relationship between the Kennedy brothers and Marilyn, much of it based on Summers' reportage. Arledge claimed that he axed the segment because, quote, it set out to be a piece which would demonstrate that because of alleged relationships between Bobby Kennedy and Marilyn Monroe, the presidency was compromised because organized crime was involved. But the piece did not live up to its billing. He labeled the story gossip column stuff. Arledge's ruling infuriated ABC producers and reporters involved in the piece. Correspondents Sylvia Chase and Geraldo Rivera left the show in protest, as did the segment producer Lowell Bergman. Mild-mannered Hugh Downs, 2020 co-anchor, angry over the decision, stated bluntly that the segment was, quote, more thoroughly documented than network coverage of Watergate at its height. Others connected with the project had long suggested that Ethel's close relationship with Arledge and her other important connections at the network were the real reason for the story being dropped. A dozen years before the 2020 piece, Ethel had been seen on Arledge's arm in Washington and New York. Parade magazine, with a weekly circulation of millions, had even mentioned that the two were dating. Ethel had additional tentacles within the network. Her son-in-law, then married to Courtney Kennedy, was Arledge's assistant. Moreover, David Burke, one of the top vice presidents of the news division, had been Ted Kennedy's chief aide. There's no doubt in my mind, speculated a 2020 staffer involved in the project, that Ethel learned what was in the piece during the reporting and the editing stages. After all, her son-in-law was working next to Roone, for God's sake. And then Courtney talked to her mother and to Jeff, and Ted said something to David Burke, and Ethel got on the horn to Roone. Whichever way it happened, the Kennedys did a quick bit of lobbying and the piece was killed. Okay, well, but was this the only time that Bobby had fiddled around and acted a fool? If only. While Bobby's affair with Marilyn had become part of legend, it wasn't his first, nor would it be his last, fling with another woman, despite his choir boy reputation. During his 18 years of marriage to Ethel, Bobby had occasionally petted others and carried on numerous flirtations. Some of his paramours were even reported to have been members of Ethel and Bobby's social circle. Said a former Hickory Hill insider, a high-profile Washington woman, a chum of Ethel's, who claimed knowledge of Bobby's indiscretions. Just like Jack, Bobby thought nothing of doing the wives of his friends. He felt honor-bound to have a sample of them, and never gave it a second thought. These women were like a great silver tray of little canapé, and when Bobby felt like popping one in his mouth, he did. Bobby was never in love with any of them, and Hickory Hill was never threatened. One of the tacit understandings in that circle was that you protected Ethel from anything that might hurt her. There was lots of whispering about Bobby playing around, but Ethel heard what she chose to hear. She knew what was going on, but she didn't bring it to the surface. Ethel threw her formidable energy behind Bobby, and he never would have left her. For a woman, it was a red badge of courage to get fumbled up with Bobby, and it was understood that if you went off with Bobby, you covered for him. The women who were named as having had flings with Bobby offered vehement denials. After making their denials, each would then point the finger at another woman, claiming that that woman had been involved with Bobby. One added, in his own subtle way, Bobby was as bad as Jack, but his sexual appetite wasn't as voracious. As for Ethel, sex had never been of great importance, one of her close friends observed. She got pregnant 11 times, but you don't have to be bothered with sex while you're pregnant, and I believe that that was her feeling. Bobby just came home, did his little husbandly thing, and she tolerated her little wifely thing, and always it resulted in a pregnancy, because both of them wanted a lot of children. Bobby had developed quite a reputation as a grabber, according to Dean Martin's ex-wife Jean, who had been at parties at Peter Lawford's house with the Kennedys. She recalled that Bobby had no qualms about flirting with a woman in one room, while Ethel was in the next. I have a friend who was in the library with him, Martin claimed, and before she knew it, the door was locked, and he threw her on a couch. It was so blatant. Ross Traphagen was part of a group of young men who included Bill Gokegan at Harvard, whom Ethel and Jean Kennedy sometimes dated when they were at Manhattanville. Years later, when Traphagen had become a prominent attorney, he was at a party in Washington with his wife, when they encountered the Attorney General on the prowl. Traphagen's wife was initially glad to see Bobby because she had been a friend of his sister Jean's and knew some of the other Kennedys and Skakels from her days as a student in Norriton, the Sacred Heart School in Connecticut. It was a private dance, and Bobby Kennedy showed up in a limousine without Ethel, who was away, Traphagen recounted. Bobby stood in the corner of the room acting like Napoleon, a little man eyeing the various women in the place. He finally cut in on my wife, and within 5 minutes said, "Why don't you come home with me? I have my car outside." Ethel's away. It was terribly brazen, but typical of what I'd heard about the Kennedys. My wife was obviously upset. I didn't want to make a scene, so I didn't confront Bobby with it. I thought what he did was typical Kennedy. Typical Bobby. Typical coward is what you were, mister. How in the world could somebody cut in on your wife, then say, "Why don't you come home with me? My car's outside, my wife's away," and you don't say a damn word? I mean, the cowardice of that. I'm not saying get into a fist fight. I'm not saying break up the party, cause a scene, and act like a redneck, but what I'm saying to you right now is you better get your ass in there and have a say to Bobby about don't you dare come at my wife like that. Ladies, isn't that what we want from our men? Do we want men to just be approaching us and then our husband stands there twiddling his thumbs? I don't know what to do. I guess that's typical Bobby. Well, you're a typical coward. Get your ass up and say something to Bobby right now. How dare he talk to me that way, is what I'd like to say. Anyway. Many attending a Hawaiian-themed party given by Maudlin Gilpatrick and her husband Roswell, Deputy Secretary of Defense, were shocked by Bobby's blatant attentions to another woman in Ethel's presence. Washington Star Society reporter Betty Beale said that while French Ambassador Herb Alphand did a hula dance with Bob McNamara's wife, Bobby was sitting on the floor next to one of the Hawaiian dancers putting his hand up her skirt. That was the only example of tastelessness at that fun party. Meanwhile, Ethel once telephoned journalist Nancy Dickerson to tell her that Joe Kennedy was offering a $1,000 prize to the sister-in-law who gave the most scintillating dinner for 10 and provided him with the best dinner partner. I was Ethel's candidate, and she wanted to book me, quote, before Eunice gets you. This is what I'm saying. Ethel knew what was going on, but then participated in it in her own sort of stupid, sugar-coated, naive way. Why are you getting for your father-in-law, your nasty father-in-law? Didn't he just have a stroke, by the way? How capable is he? I guess even in his incapacitated state, he was going to drag his left leg to a party to go sit next to a pretty girl. I don't know. But what the heck? During a cookout at Hickory Hill, while Ethel was vacationing in Hyannisport, Bobby, then a U.S. Senator, went for a motorcycle ride with Polly Bussell, a beautiful blonde Radcliffe graduate in her early 20s, who was working on scheduling in Bobby's Senate office. Journalist Douglas Kicker, who occasionally dated Polly and was present at the party, said that Bobby and Polly, both in bathing suits, had driven to a nearby wooded area when a McLean police car pulled in. When Bobby saw the cops, he took off into the underbrush, leaving this tall blonde in a bikini standing there, Kicker said later. So here was Polly all alone on her motorcycle. The cops escorted her back into Hickory Hill. After they left, Bobby appeared out of the bush. It was the Chappaquiddick syndrome long before Chappaquiddick. The way Polly had told it to me, it was just a flat-out innocent ride on a motorcycle. But that's how Bobby handled it. Bustle, who had been personally hired by Bobby after he met her in 1966 at the Martha Vineyards home of writer William Styron, confirmed later that she had taken Bobby, quote, for a couple of motorcycle rides, but that her memory wasn't clear about the incident in Hickory Hill. Bustle had received a number of invitations from both Bobby and Ethel to parties at Hickory Hill. I spent much more time with Robert Kennedy than with Ethel, she said. I felt I was definitely a friend, but not necessarily with her. Ethel had given Polly special instructions not to tell any of the other office staffers about the invitations so they wouldn't be jealous. A Hickory Hill insider noted that Bobby often told Ethel which women to invite to parties. They were the cute blondes, the ones Bobby liked to have around him, and Ethel never seemed to object. She always just went along with whatever he wanted. But Bobby had a double standard. And this is, if you're not annoyed enough already, take a seat, because you're just going to fall out at the way he behaved. In this particular scenario, the little hypocrite. Bobby had a double standard, whether it involved Ethel or other men who cheated on their wives. Once at a party in Greenwich, Bobby became outraged when he saw Ethel dancing with Ray O'Connell, a New York businessman. Helen Downey, a friend of the Skakels, remembered being shocked by Bobby's performance. Ray tapped Ethel to dance and sort of gave her a little pat on the behind because they'd known each other for years, Downey said. Bobby came over and grabbed Ethel and said, "Listen, why are you acting like a whore? I don't want to be married to a whore. Get out of here. You're not dancing with anybody." I was just so surprised at the way he behaved. It was shocking, and Ethel looked dumbfounded. I cannot describe to you the fight that we would have had that night if I came home with my philandering husband and he had called me out like that on the dance floor, called me a whore because some guy wanted to dance with me. Did I pat my own bottom? Like, if you're offended by that, okay, fine. Be annoyed that this guy, took a little liberty. But if you're mad about that, call him out. Oh my gosh. Another time during a South African fact-finding trip, Bobby discovered that a friend, a Washington journalist, had been cheating on his wife. When Bobby returned home, he told Gerald Tremblay, who also knew the writer, that he had been repulsed and wanted nothing more to do with the man. When this thing about Marilyn Monroe came up, I was astounded because if it was true, it would have made Bobby a hypocritical guy, and I never thought of him that way, Tremblay said. In the future, Ethel would be faced with more rumors about Bobby's womanizing, with another actress and with one of their friends. In October 1962, 2 months after Marilyn Monroe's death, Ethel became pregnant for the first time in 3 years, the longest she'd gone during her years of marriage to Bobby. Okay, so that was a long episode about really only one thing, but I think it was riveting. And I also think that Bobby's inflammation over what he suspected was somebody else's cheating, and his unkindness to Ethel when he saw her dancing with somebody else, was really more of his rage and indignation that was directed at himself. All of that overreaction, you're a whore, get off the dance floor, and I can't believe that guy's cheating on his wife, I don't want to have anything to do with him. What he really means is, I'm a whore, I should get off the dance floor, and I can't believe I'm doing this to Ethel. He'd been raised better than this. It doesn't matter that his brother was doing this. It doesn't matter that his father had always acted like this. I mean, he knew. We all have a code of ethics written on our hearts. That's why it feels bad when we don't do the right thing, because it's ingrained in us what is right and what is wrong. It doesn't feel good to cheat on your spouse, right? He would have known that. And instead of curbing his problems, he tried to show that he still had a moral core by going after people who he saw doing the very same thing he did. Because then he could tell himself, I'm not too far gone. I can see when things are wrong. But he wasn't willing to put in the work in his own life to change what was going on in his own life. Anyway, that's just what I think. Thank you guys so much for hanging out with me. And tomorrow is Thanksgiving. So I hope those of you in America who are celebrating are enjoying it. Have a great time with your friends, with your family. I hope it's restorative. I hope it's a great time. And I'll see you guys on Friday. Bye.